The wind howled across the desolate plains of Montana Territory in 1883, carrying with it the scent of rain and something far more ominous. Samuel Mackenzie wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he surveyed his struggling ranch, the Circle M, where cattle grazed on increasingly sparse grassland. The drought had been merciless, and creditors circled like vultures overhead. But Samuel was a stubborn man, carved from the same unforgiving stone as the Rocky Mountains that loomed in the distance. He had built this ranch with his bare hands after the Civil War, and he would be damned if he let it slip away now. As the sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the prairie, Samuel noticed something unusual near the muddy banks of Willow Creek. A horse, a magnificent paint mare with distinctive markings, was trapped in the thick, sucking mud that had formed after the recent sparse rains. The animal's eyes rolled in terror as it struggled desperately, only sinking deeper with each frantic movement. Most ranchers would have put the poor creature out of its misery with a single shot, but something about this horse struck Samuel as different. The markings on its hide told a story, symbols he had seen before during his time as a cavalry scout, symbols that belonged to the Lakota people. Samuel knew the risks of helping a horse that clearly belonged to the Native Americans who still roamed these territories. The peace treaties were fragile at best, and tensions ran high between the white settlers and the indigenous tribes. But as he looked into the mare's desperate eyes, he saw something of himself, something that refused to give up despite impossible odds. He spent the better part of 3 hours working to free the animal, using ropes, wooden planks, and every ounce of strength his aging body could muster. By the time he finally pulled the exhausted horse from the mud, both man and beast were covered in grime, but alive. Samuel led the mare to his barn, where he cleaned her wounds and provided fresh water and hay. The horse was clearly well-trained and valuable, with intricate beadwork woven into her mane and symbols painted on her flanks that spoke of her importance to whoever owned her. As he worked, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched from the darkness beyond his property. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, but when he peered into the shadows, he saw nothing but swaying grass and the distant silhouettes of his own cattle. That night, Samuel barely slept. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. Every creak of the old ranch house timbers made him reach for the rifle beside his bed. He had lived on the frontier long enough to know when trouble was brewing, and the air itself seemed charged with an electric tension that made his skin crawl. The rescued horse remained calm in the barn, but Samuel noticed that his own animals seemed restless, as if they sensed something approaching that their human caretaker could not yet perceive. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Montana landscape, painting the sky in shades of steel and silver. Samuel was checking on the mare when he heard it, the sound that every frontier settler both dreaded and respected. The rhythmic beating of unshod hooves against the hard-packed earth, approaching his ranch with deliberate purpose. He stepped out of the barn to see a sight that made his blood run cold and his heart race simultaneously. Riding toward his property was a group of Lakota warriors, their faces painted for what could be either ceremony or war, their weapons clearly visible but not yet drawn. At the head of the group rode a man who commanded attention without saying a word. Chief Wakantanka, whose name meant Great Spirit in the Lakota tongue, was a figure of legend throughout the territory. Samuel had heard stories of this man's wisdom, his fierce protection of his people, and his strategic brilliance in dealing with the encroaching white settlers. The chief was older than Samuel had expected, perhaps 60 winters, with silver threading through his long black hair and lines etched deeply around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and great sorrow. The group stopped 50 yards from Samuel's ranch house, close enough to make their presence unmistakably known, but far enough to avoid immediate confrontation. Samuel stood perfectly still, his hand resting near but not on his sidearm, knowing that any sudden movement could be interpreted as hostile. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, broken only by the sound of horses breathing and leather creaking in the morning air. Samuel's mind raced through possibilities, none of them particularly comforting. Chief Wakantanka dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his entire life on horseback. He approached Samuel with measured steps, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the ranch, the barn, and the white man who stood before him. When he spoke, His English was perfect, though heavily accented with the musical cadences of his native tongue. "You have something that belongs to my people," he said, his voice carrying the weight of mountains and the patience of rivers carving through stone. Samuel nodded slowly, gesturing toward the barn. "The paint mare. Found her stuck in the mud down by Willow Creek. Figured somebody would come looking for her eventually." He paused, studying the chief's weathered face for any sign of his intentions. "She's been treated well. Clean water, fresh hay, wounds tended to proper." The chief's expression remained unreadable as he walked toward the barn, his warriors remaining mounted but alert. Samuel followed at a respectful distance, acutely aware that his life hung in the balance of the next few minutes. Inside the barn, the mare nickered softly at the sight of the chief, and Samuel watched as the old man's stoic facade cracked slightly. There was genuine affection in the way he approached the horse, running his weathered hands along her neck and speaking to her in rapid Lakota. "This horse," the chief said finally, turning to face Samuel, "belonged to my grandson. He was killed 3 days ago by men who looked like you, men with pale skin and greed in their hearts. They took his horse and left his body for the carrion birds." The words hit Samuel like physical blows, and he felt his knees go weak. The implications were staggering, and he realized that he was now caught in the middle of something far larger and more dangerous than a simple case of returning lost property. Samuel's mind raced as he processed this information. If the horse had been stolen from a dead Lakota warrior, and if he had been the one to rescue it, then his actions could be interpreted any number of ways by the chief and his men. He could be seen as complicit in the crime, or as an honorable man who had shown respect for the dead, or as a pawn in some larger game he didn't yet understand. The silence in the barn was deafening, broken only by the soft sounds of the mare munching hay and the distant calls of meadowlarks greeting the morning. "I didn't know," Samuel said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just saw an animal in trouble and couldn't walk away." He met the chief's eyes directly, knowing that any sign of deception would likely be his last mistake. "I've got my own troubles, Chief. Drought's been hard on the cattle, banks breathing down my neck. Last thing I need is more problems. But I couldn't let that horse die in the mud." Chief Wakantanka studied Samuel for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to peer directly into the white man's soul. The weight of his gaze was almost unbearable, and Samuel felt as if every decision he had ever made, every moment of his life, was being judged and weighed. Finally, the chief spoke again, his voice carrying a strange mixture of sadness and something that might have been respect. "My grandson's name was Singing Wolf. He was 16 winters old, brave and proud, perhaps too much so for his own good." The chief continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller, painting pictures with words that made the barn seem to fade away around them. "3 nights ago, Singing Wolf rode out alone, against my wishes, to prove himself as a warrior. He had heard rumors of white men stealing horses from our herds, and he wanted to track them down, to bring back proof of their crimes. I should have stopped him, should have sent experienced warriors with him, but I thought perhaps it was time for him to learn the lessons that only solitude and danger can teach." Samuel listened in growing horror as the chief described how Singing Wolf had apparently tracked the horse thieves to their camp, only to be discovered and killed in the confrontation that followed. The thieves had taken his horse as a trophy, along with the sacred items that marked him as the grandson of a chief. But something had gone wrong during their escape, and the horse had somehow broken free, only to become trapped in the mud where Samuel had found her. "The men who killed my grandson," Chief Wakantanka said, his voice growing colder, "they are still out there, still stealing, still killing, still bringing shame to all pale faces who claim to be honorable. This is why we came here, Samuel Mackenzie. Not just for the horse, but because we need to know what kind of man you are." The use of his name sent a chill down Samuel's spine. He had not introduced himself, which meant the chief and his warriors had been watching him for some time, learning about him, deciding whether he was friend or foe. The realization that he had been under surveillance made him feel exposed and vulnerable in ways he hadn't experienced since his days as a cavalry scout during the Indian Wars. "How long have you been watching me?" Samuel asked, though he wasn't sure he really wanted to know the answer. Long enough, the chief replied cryptically. Long enough to see that you work alone, that you treat your animals well, that you do not waste what the earth provides. Long enough to see that you are struggling but have not turned to theft or violence to solve your problems. Long enough to know that you are not like the men who killed my grandson. Samuel felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at these words. If the chief had determined that he was not a threat, then perhaps he would live through this encounter. But the mention of horse thieves operating in the area brought a new set of concerns. If there were men in the territory who were bold enough to kill a chief's grandson, then no one was truly safe, white settler or Native American alike. Chief, Samuel said carefully, if these men are still operating in the area, then we might have a mutual problem. I've lost 3 head of cattle in the past week. Thought it was just the drought driving them to seek better grazing. But now I'm wondering if maybe they were stolen instead. The chief's eyes sharpened with interest. Tell me about these missing cattle. When did you last see them? What direction did their tracks lead? Samuel described the missing animals and the strange tracks he had found near his eastern pasture. Marks that seemed to indicate the cattle had been driven rather than simply wandered away. As he spoke, he noticed that several of the Lakota warriors had dismounted and were now standing near the barn entrance, listening intently to every word. These tracks you describe, one of the younger warriors said, speaking in accented but clear English. They match what we found near the place where Singing Wolf died. The same iron shoes on the horses, the same pattern of movement. The men who killed my cousin are the same ones who have been taking your cattle. The revelation hit Samuel like a thunderbolt. The idea that he and the Lakota were victims of the same criminal gang had never occurred to him, but it made perfect sense. Horse thieves and cattle rustlers often work together, moving stolen livestock across territorial boundaries where local law enforcement had limited jurisdiction. The vast, empty spaces of Montana Territory provided perfect cover for such operations. Chief Wakantanka was quiet for several minutes, clearly thinking through the implications of this new information. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a momentous decision. Samuel Mackenzie, I have come here today prepared to do one of 2 things. If you had proven to be like the men who killed my grandson, I would have taken justice with my own hands. But you are not like them. Instead, I find that we share a common enemy. Samuel held his breath, waiting for the chief to continue. The next words could determine not just his immediate fate, but the future of his ranch and possibly his life. I propose something that has never been done before in this territory, the chief said slowly. An alliance between your ranch and my people. We will help you find and stop the men who have been stealing from both of us. In return, you will provide sanctuary for Lakota warriors who are tracking these criminals, and you will serve as a bridge between our peoples when misunderstandings arise. The proposal was staggering in its implications. An alliance between a white rancher and a Lakota chief would be unprecedented in Montana Territory, and potentially dangerous for both parties. Samuel knew that many of his white neighbors would view such an arrangement as treason, while the chief risked being seen as a collaborator by members of his own tribe who advocated for complete separation from white society. But as Samuel considered the offer, he realized that it might be the solution to more problems than just the immediate threat of cattle rustlers. His ranch was failing, his resources stretched thin, and he faced the prospect of losing everything he had worked for. An alliance with the Lakota could provide the security and mutual support that both groups needed to survive in the harsh realities of frontier life. Chief, Samuel said finally, I accept your proposal, but I want to know what we're really getting into. These men who killed your grandson and stole my cattle, how many of them are there? How well armed? And do you have any idea where they might be hiding? The chief smiled for the first time since arriving at the ranch, and Samuel was surprised by how the expression transformed his weathered features. Now you are asking the right questions, Samuel Mackenzie. The men we seek number perhaps 8 or 10, well armed and mounted on fast horses. They have been operating from a hidden camp somewhere in the Absaroka Range, moving their stolen livestock through secret trails known only to smugglers and outlaws. One of the Lakota warriors stepped forward, a man perhaps 40 years old with intricate tattoos covering his arms and the distinctive scars of a seasoned fighter. I am Standing Bear, war leader of Chief Wakantanka's band. For 2 weeks, we have been tracking these thieves, learning their patterns, mapping their routes. They are clever, but they are not invisible. We know where they will strike next. The warrior's words sent a thrill of anticipation through Samuel. For the first time since discovering his missing cattle, he felt as though he might actually have a chance of recovering his property and bringing the thieves to justice. But he also understood that such an operation would be extremely dangerous, potentially deadly for everyone involved. "When do we move?" Samuel asked, surprising himself with the determination in his voice. Chief Wakantanka studied him carefully. "First, we must plan. These are not simple raiders we face, but organized criminals with connections to corrupt officials in territorial government. They have been selling stolen livestock to buyers as far away as Denver and Salt Lake City, using forged bills of sale and bribing inspectors to look the other way." The scope of the criminal operation was larger than Samuel had imagined. What he had initially thought was a local problem was actually part of a territory-wide network of theft and corruption. The realization was both intimidating and infuriating, as it explained why local law enforcement had been so ineffective in stopping the thefts. As the morning progressed, Samuel found himself drawn into increasingly detailed planning sessions with Chief Wakantanka and his warriors. Maps were drawn in the dirt outside the barn, showing the locations of known theft sites, suspected hideouts, and the complex trail networks that the criminals used to move stolen livestock. The level of intelligence that the Lakota had gathered was impressive, demonstrating a surveillance operation that had been months in the making. "My grandson's death," the chief explained, "was not the beginning of our interest in these criminals. They have been stealing from us for almost a year, taking not just horses but sacred items, weapons, and supplies. Singing Wolf's death was simply the final outrage that forced us to take action." Samuel began to understand that he had stumbled into the middle of a conflict that was far more complex than he had initially realized. The horse thieves were not just opportunistic criminals, but part of a systematic campaign that was targeting both white settlers and Native Americans with equal ruthlessness. The plan that emerged from their discussions was ambitious and dangerous. Rather than simply trying to track down the thieves after their next raid, Chief Wakantanka proposed setting a trap that would force the criminals to come to them. Samuel's ranch would serve as the bait, with a carefully orchestrated scenario designed to make the thieves believe they had found an easy target. The plan required Samuel to appear more vulnerable than he actually was. He would drive his remaining cattle to graze in the exposed eastern pasture, making them appear unguarded and ripe for theft. Meanwhile, Lakota warriors would be concealed in strategic positions around the property, ready to spring the trap when the thieves made their move. It was a dangerous gamble that could result in the loss of everything Samuel had left, but it was also his best chance of stopping the criminals once and for all. 3 days later, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, the trap was set. Samuel sat on his porch, deliberately appearing relaxed and unaware, while his new allies waited in hidden positions throughout his property. The cattle grazed peacefully in the eastern pasture, seemingly unprotected except for Samuel's aging ranch dog, Blue, who dozed in the afternoon sun. The attack came just before sunset, exactly as Chief Wakantanka had predicted. 8 masked riders thundered onto Samuel's property, whooping and firing shots into the air as they began driving his cattle toward the mountain passes. But their celebration was premature. At a signal from Standing Bear, concealed Lakota warriors rose from their hiding places like ghosts emerging from the earth itself. The battle was fierce but brief. The thieves, caught completely off guard by the coordinated ambush, found themselves surrounded by adversaries who knew the terrain intimately and fought with the desperate fury of men seeking justice for their fallen kinsmen. Within minutes, 6 of the 8 criminals lay dead or dying on Samuel's land, while the remaining 2 were taken prisoner by the Lakota warriors. Among the captured men was someone Samuel recognized with shock: Deputy Marshal Tom Brennan, a corrupt territorial official who had been taking bribes to look the other way while the criminal network operated with impunity. Brennan's involvement explained how the thieves had managed to avoid law enforcement for so long and why their operation had grown so bold and extensive. Chief Wakantanka interrogated the surviving prisoners with a combination of traditional Lakota justice and frontier pragmatism. The information they provided revealed the full scope of the criminal network, including the names of other corrupt officials, the locations of hidden camps where stolen livestock was processed, and the identities of buyers in distant cities who were knowingly purchasing stolen animals. But the most shocking revelation came when Deputy Brennan, in a desperate attempt to save his own life, revealed the true reason behind Singing Wolf's murder. The young Lakota warrior had not simply stumbled upon the thieves by accident. He had been deliberately lured into a trap by someone who knew his movements and his desire to prove himself as a warrior. "The boy was getting too close to our operation," Brennan confessed, blood trickling from his split lip. "Someone in your tribe has been feeding us information about Lakota movements, telling us when warriors would be riding alone, when camps would be vulnerable. Your grandson's death wasn't random. It was ordered." The accusation hit Chief Wakantanka like a physical blow. The idea that someone among his own people had betrayed Singing Wolf to his death was almost too horrible to contemplate. Samuel watched as the old chief's face went through a range of emotions: disbelief, rage, profound sadness, and finally, a cold determination that was more frightening than any display of anger. The chief's investigation into the traitor within his own ranks was swift and thorough. Using information extracted from the captured criminals, he was able to identify a young warrior named Broken Arrow who had been secretly meeting with the thieves, providing them with intelligence about Lakota movements in exchange for whiskey and gold. The betrayal cut deeply into the heart of the tribe, as Broken Arrow was not just any warrior, but Singing Wolf's own cousin, a man who had been trusted with the safety of the very person he had delivered to his death. Traditional Lakota justice was harsh but fair. Broken Arrow was stripped of his warrior status, banished from the tribe, and marked with symbols that would identify him to other Native American groups as a traitor and murderer. For a Lakota warrior, such punishment was often considered worse than death, as it meant permanent exile from everything that gave life meaning and purpose. Samuel found himself deeply moved by the ceremony of justice that followed. Despite the cultural differences between himself and the Lakota, he recognized in their traditions the same fundamental desire for fairness and accountability that drove his own moral compass. The alliance between his ranch and Chief Wakantanka's band was cemented not just by mutual benefit, but by shared values and mutual respect. In the weeks that followed, the partnership proved beneficial for both sides. Lakota warriors helped Samuel recover his stolen cattle from the hidden camps in the Absaroka Range, while Samuel provided the legal standing needed to bring the surviving criminals to territorial justice. The corruption network was exposed and dismantled, with several officials removed from office and prosecuted for their crimes. The rescued paint mare became a symbol of the alliance between Samuel's ranch and the Lakota band. Chief Wakantanka gifted the horse to Samuel as a token of respect and gratitude, though he made it clear that the animal retained her sacred status and must be treated with appropriate reverence. Samuel accepted the gift with humility, understanding that he was now the guardian of something far more valuable than simple livestock. As autumn turned to winter on the Montana plains, Samuel's ranch began to prosper in ways he had never imagined possible. The alliance with the Lakota provided security, knowledge of the land, and access to trading opportunities that had previously been impossible. In return, Samuel's ranch served as a neutral meeting ground where disputes between white settlers and Native Americans could be resolved peacefully, preventing the escalation of conflicts that might otherwise have led to bloodshed. The story of the poor rancher who pulled a horse from the mud and ended up forging an unprecedented alliance with a Lakota chief became legend throughout Montana territory. It demonstrated that even in the harsh realities of frontier life, honor, courage, and mutual respect could overcome the prejudices and fears that too often divided different peoples. Years later, when historians wrote about the peaceful transition of Montana from territorial status to statehood, they would note the unique role played by the alliance between Samuel Mackenzie's Circle M Ranch and Chief Wakantanka's band. It served as a model for cooperation that helped prevent the worst excesses of cultural conflict that plagued other parts of the American West. Samuel never forgot the lesson he learned that fateful morning when he chose to help a wounded horse instead of walking away. Sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can set in motion events that change the course of history. The paint mare lived out her days on the Circle M ranch, bearing foals that carried both the wildness of the plains and the gentle wisdom of those who had learned that strength comes not from standing alone, but from standing together with those who share your values, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they speak.